Hello, everyone. This is Brian Datesman, editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist and host of History of the Present. This is a long-form interview series co-produced by The Intellectualist and Lincoln Square. History of the Present, we like to examine all the major inflection points that are currently reshaping our world, whether it's AI, climate change, democracy, technology, inequality, migration, and the future of the international order. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Professor Michael Mann. Professor Mann is a Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania, with a secondary appointment in the Annenberg School for Communication. He's also director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. Professor Mann is one of the world's most important climate scientists. His work helped produce the famous hockey stick graph, one of the clearest visual representations of human-driven warming. He was also a lead author on the Observed Climate Variability and Change chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Third Assessment Report, and he contributed with other IPCC authors to the work for which the IPCC shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. In addition, he spent decades explaining not only the science of climate change, but also the politics, the misinformation, the media story about it. His latest book, co-authored with Professor Dr. Hotez, is Science Under Siege: How to Fight the Five Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. This book examines the anti-science movement, the political, media, and economic forces that are currently undermining science with the public. Professor Mann, thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you. It's also almost tiring to hear all of that. We've been at this for way too long. We have been fighting this battle for way too long. But it's an honor to speak with you. A big fan of you guys, everything that you do to try to inform the larger public discourse over the great challenges we face. And there's none greater, of course, than the climate crisis.
Well, Dr. Mann, thank you so much, sir. I just want to start with a really basic question. And it's something I'm sure you've been seeing in the news, on television. Western Europe is experiencing extreme heat, record-breaking temperatures, public health warnings. There's wildfire risk, infrastructure stress. When you look at what is happening right now in Europe, what does this tell you about the state of the global climate system, Professor?
Yeah, in fact, I was there just after that heat wave. I was in Paris for a couple days to do an interview with a television network there, and left North America to arrive back in the U.S. only to experience another record heat wave here on the east coast of the U.S. And so these heat domes, these centers of high pressure, extreme warm temperatures, are associated with, the sort of tendency in the summer. You get more of these high pressure systems that move up into North America, they move up into Europe. That's always happened. What hasn't always happened is that they become as deep as they are, they become as locked in place, as persistent as they are, and they become as hot as they are. It's not rocket science to say when you warm up the planet by burning fossil fuels and generating heat trapping carbon pollution, you're going to see more frequent and intense heat extremes. And that's what we're seeing. And we simply would not be seeing these record-breaking heat waves, heat domes, if not for the fact that we are warming up the planet, again, by burning fossil fuels and generating carbon pollution.
Professor, for decades, climate scientists, they've warned that these heat waves are going to become more frequent, more intense, more dangerous to humans and life in general. Are we now living in the climate future that scientists were warning about? I recall as a younger man being in the 90s, middle school and high school, learning about the future. Are we in that future now, Professor?
Yeah, we are. And there's a quote, and I won't get it quite right, but it was spoken by a good friend of mine and one of my heroes, Sherwood Rowland. And he was one of he shared the Nobel Prize in chemistry for the discovery of the ozone hole and the factors, the chemistry behind the depletion of the ozone in our stratosphere, which was due to the emission of chlorofluorocarbons, chemicals in spray cans and refrigerants that were literally destroying our ozone layer, and that was leading to increased cancer risk in the southern hemisphere in particular. And so he once said, it spoke to his experience in doing the fundamental science that ultimately had implications for global environmental policy. And he said something to the effect that, what good is it to do the science only to watch your predictions come true? And that's what happened with the ozone hole. And that is indeed, as you allude to, Brian, that is what's happening with human-caused climate change. And it's a Pyrrhic victory at best for us to be able to say as scientists that we are seeing our predictions come true. It's the last thing that we want to see, but it is indeed where we are now, thanks to the politics of inaction.
I imagine that actually must be kind of very upsetting in a way to have called this out multiple decades ago, and then things have gotten worse, and now you're seeing. I mean, that must have a psychological toll on you, Professor, does it?
Well, you tend to, I guess, when it's sort of like being in a war, because we are in a war against these forces that are opposing climate action. It's a war on us. It's a war on the planet. And there's sort of this battlefield mentality. You're focused on the battle. And if you had the time to sort of step back and ponder our predicament, it would be easy to become depressed, to become angry, to experience all of those emotions. But we try, to funnel those emotions towards both, our efforts, the energy behind our efforts to inform the public and policymakers, and our efforts to fight back against this massive disinformation machine. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that here.
Professor, when people hear climate change, right, they often think of something that's very gradual and distant, and people have a hard time with the idea of constant marginal change, right? Because it's not something maybe we think through. I mean, the idea that climate change is some far away, how do you think that is maybe prevented some of the more needed discourse?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's far away in both time and space is the way it's often been presented. And, we've made, there's some unforced errors here when it comes to the climate advocacy community. For example, in making the polar bear sort of the poster child of the climate crisis. And for so long, right, it was those images of polar bears stranded on ice floes up in the Arctic. It makes it feel so distant, maybe it's impacting these animals that I've never seen way off in the Arctic where I've never been. And maybe that's, decades down the road where that's really going to be a problem. And so it creates psychological distance, and psychological distance provides ammunition to the sort of forces of business as usual. The fossil fuel interests, those advocating for them, they just want to buy time. They know we'll move on. They know the age of fossil fuels will be behind us and the age of clean energy is coming, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. All they're trying to do at this point is to buy time, because by buying time, they're buying billions and billions of additional profits in their primary assets. These fossil fuel companies are the fossil fuels that are still buried beneath the ground, and they want to be able to monetize those assets, and they're doing everything they can to draw this out. The problem is we can't afford to draw this out any further. We have to decarbonize our societal infrastructure essentially within the next decade. We need a fundamental transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy if there's going to be any hope of keeping the warming of the planet below truly catastrophic levels.
Yeah, and that's what I want to get to, Professor, because even if we were to cut all, hypothetically, this is an impossible hypothetical, but let's say magic wand, all fossil fuel emissions done right now, we would still have more warming, right? I think part of the challenge is it's a moving dynamic target in a very complex system. And the complex, and it's maybe not as complex as maybe not as complex as it's made out to be. And I think it's maybe made more complex by the people who are against doing anything.
Sure, exactly.
Bury their head in the sand. But just so I understand, even if we were to significantly cut back and we were to, let's say, members of Congress say, yeah, I agree with Professor Mann, we're going to do that in 10 years, and there would still be warming. We would still be in a tough spot.
Yeah. And I would point out that there were people like Lyndsay Graham who would have said something like that a decade and a half ago. So we've actually moved in the wrong direction. In the days of John McCain, there was sort of an emerging bipartisan consensus that, we might disagree about what the policies should be, but we can agree that we have a problem. And unfortunately, we've seen retrenchment in the age of Trump, and we've seen the Republican Party now sort of consolidate around a policy of inaction, which is a product and part of their very how tightly linked they are now to the fossil fuel industry. So there's a little bit of good news here, Brian. What the science of the last 15 years or so has shown us is that it isn't quite as bad as you described it. Now, we are at fault because for years, and I myself am implicated here, we were actually, that was the narrative that we were sort of spelling out, that, I would use the term the procrastination penalty, that the longer we wait, the more warming there is going to be in the pipeline, even if we stop burning fossil fuels. And that's the way we thought things worked, a couple decades ago, because the models that we were using were fairly crude in the sense that they were missing one key ingredient, the global carbon cycle, and the ability of the oceans and the vegetation over the Earth's surface to absorb carbon dioxide. So while it's true that there is this thing called committed warming, that all else being equal, the climate is like a locomotive. And if you slam on the brakes, you don't come to a screeching halt. You might go another half mile down the tracks before you stop. There's that inertia. And the climate system has that sort of inertia, in large part because the oceans are so sluggish in their ability to absorb heat. And that would keep the planet warming even when we stopped adding CO2 to the atmosphere, if not for a mitigating effect, which is once we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, those CO2 levels start to come down because the oceans are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. The vegetation is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And believe it or not, those two different things, one which would lead to additional warming and one which actually implies cooling, cancel out, and you get a flat line. What does that mean? It means when we bring carbon emissions to zero, and the models now tell us this with some degree of confidence, the surface of the planet stops warming almost immediately.
Wow.
That's really important because it means that there's a direct and immediate consequence of our efforts to decarbonize our infrastructure. So again, the science gives us a little bit of good news. Now, the bad news here is that we're still elevated at those temperatures for decades to come, unless we were to actively take carbon out of the atmosphere through some sort of technology or massive reforestation, massive afforestation. There are things we could do to try to actually cool the planet back down, but it'll basically stay elevated. And that means that the impacts that we are already experiencing, those are pretty much locked in.
Yeah.
There is already permanent damage that's being done, and all we can do is mitigate that damage. And so the core of your argument is correct. There is damage, there is destruction, there is death that is now sort of locked in. And we need to do the best we can to adapt to the warming that is now locked in and the impacts that are now locked in, while doing everything we can to prevent the problem from getting worse. And that means getting off fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
Professor, let me just follow up on that.
Yeah.
We've seen sort of heat affect transportation,
yep,
power systems, agriculture, water, even nuclear power operations.
That's right.
My question is more, are we as modern societies built for the climates of 2030, 2026? Are we? What in terms of resilience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll make a gratuitous mention of another book I wrote a few years ago, Our Fragile Moment, which is actually about that. It's about the lessons we can learn from Earth history that addresses this very question. What is the sort of envelope of climate variability within which human beings can exist? The civilization essentially emerged about 6,000 years ago in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia. The first true city state emerged in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago. And so if you look at the time interval of the past 6,000 years, and you look at global temperatures, the range of variation has been extremely small. And what we're doing is we are now very dramatically leaving that envelope of natural variability that we have experienced during the entire interval over which human civilization has existed. That suggests that that there is this massive population now of 8 billion people who rely upon civilizational infrastructure that is tied to this very stable climate during which it emerged. And as we continue to warm the planet and change the climate, we are leaving that that envelope that we have adapted to. And the more quickly and the more dramatically we leave that envelope, the more it calls into question any possibility of us adapting to these changes. The critics, you'll hear them these days. It's harder to deny it's happening. So you hear all these other arguments. Well, we can just adapt is one of them. And that's very popular among, Republicans like Marco Rubio of Florida. We'll just adapt to the global sea level rise. And I guess what he means is that we'll grow gills and fins as the oceans literally. I mean, it's almost,
it's not a serious.
Yeah, it would be funny if it weren't so pernicious. So there's this idea that we can adapt. Well, no, we are talking about rates of change that human beings have never had to adapt to in the past, and other living things have never had to adapt to.
If I may, too, Professor, maybe you could speak to this a little. But I recall I took an earth science course many years ago, and one of the biggest drivers of extinctions is climate change. And carbon and gases blocking the sun. Can you maybe speak to how we're only 300,000, our species, modern human Homo sapiens are only 300,000 years old.
That's right.
Our climate, what you were just saying is we've evolved to live in a very tight band. And when you start messing with that, especially to the degree we are messing with it, we're talking about, again, we can go to the hockey stick, right? If we want, because that's going to go to the next question. If possible, if we can put up the hockey stick so people can see the huge, right? So you see this you see this, and then this, and again, I don't know how many standard deviations this is. Look again, but this is pretty significant going from 1800. So this is probably around when they get fossil fuel. We're talking about Rockefeller. World War II is probably here. Go up. Can you maybe speak to that? How crazy the changes from literally just even my grandparents who were born in the 1900s.
Absolutely. The hockey stick is a visual representation of how dramatic that warming is and how unprecedented it is. And there are various ways that scientists can sort of address this question, like how likely would we be seeing this amount of warming over this time frame from natural variability? What's the chance that it would happen? And there was an article about 10 years ago that showed that that question, climate scientists had reached the sort of the gold standard in science, 5 sigma.
Yeah.
The 5, and what that means, you're 5 standard deviations out. It's astronomically unlikely that you could possibly explain this if not for the warming of the planet from our carbon emissions. I'll just add one more thing here as well, because you alluded to some of these past periods of warming. And actually, Our Fragile Moment, that book was about that, about some of these past episodes like the PETM, the Paleocene Eocene thermal. It was a period of rapid release of greenhouse gases and rapid warming, and there was a massive extinction. The end Permian extinction at the end of the Permian, beginning of the Triassic period, that was the largest extinction in history. Nearly
75%, or was it 90%?
90% of all organisms, and 97% species-wise, 97% of all marine species perished in that event. And it was a rapid injection of carbon into the atmosphere and a rapid warming. And that was natural. In that case, it was an unusually intense period of volcanism. And we call those very rapid events, but they're orders of magnitude slower than today. And to just give you a sense of those orders of magnitude, what we're doing is we're taking carbon that nature buried beneath Earth's surface over 100 million years, since the time of the mid-Cretaceous, say, when CO2 levels were very high, more than 100 million years ago. Over time, natural processes, weathering processes, balanced by plate tectonics, you get these long-term changes, and that carbon was buried beneath the surface. And so we're taking carbon that was buried beneath the surface over 100 million years, and we're releasing it into the atmosphere over 100 years. We're putting it back 1 million times faster than nature buried it. And you can find the most rapid analog, you can look for the most rapid analog, whether the PETM, the end Permian, you can look for these natural abrupt warming events, and none of them are even within orders of magnitude as abrupt as the warming we are causing today. And that's what's so important, because you'll hear critics, you'll hear climate deniers say, hey, the planet was once warmer back in the days of the dinosaurs. It isn't just the temperature of the planet. It's what temperature living things on that planet are adapted to, and how quickly you are moving away from that. And that's a lesson that we can learn from the extinction of the dinosaurs. There's a whole chapter on that, because there's a lesson there as well in the impacts of abrupt climate change. And so there is no way to understand the historical geological record of extinctions and not appreciate the profound impact that carbon dioxide has, and then to make the connection. And we are increasing it faster than in any of those natural events.
Professor, I mean, I recall learning a statistic, and maybe you can speak to this, but extinction is very common. Something like 99% of all species that have ever lived have gone extinct, from, if I recall that statistic. What do you think this says about adaptation, and if we don't adapt?
Yeah, and again, I sound like a broken record, but that's really the theme of our fragile moment, is to look at some of those episodes and see what they tell us about fragility, what they tell us about the limits of adaptation. I spent quite a bit of time talking about the KT extinction event. That was 66 million years ago, when the asteroid hit the planet, and there was a cascade of catastrophic consequences that essentially killed off. We used to say it killed off the dinosaurs. That's not quite true, because birds are basically living dinosaurs. So technically the non-avian dinosaurs, and basically any organism larger than, a Labrador retriever perished in that event. And that was a rapid cooling event, but it was still a dramatic movement away from the climate that life was adapted to. And again, I'll just make this point. The dinosaurs had no agency. There was nothing they could, even if they understood that they were about to be hit by an asteroid. And the day after the Don't Look Up, the movie, is sort of right. Homage to that in the context of climate change. Even if they understood their predicament, there was nothing they could do about it. They had no agency. We don't have that excuse.
And what do you think about this? That the fact that some of the richest people in the world, and because I recall a statistic by Bloomberg, it was in Bloomberg, they said about 5 million humans die every year. because of climate change. I mean, what is your thought, just morally? Let's get away from the science, which you really eloquently explained, but the morally that you have these wealthy people who are consigning a lot of poor humans to
That's
just
right.
horrific deaths.
Yeah.
Can you maybe speak to that? How
Yeah.
make it more real? Because that's what's
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah, and it's actually even worse than what you described there. If you take into account the full sort of health footprint of fossil fuel burning, because it isn't just the climate change it's generating, it's the air and water pollution, burning of fossil fuels, extraction, refineries, the pollution. So there are studies that suggest that 25% of all premature deaths are caused by fossil fuels,
Wow.
either by the direct health consequences of extraction and burning fossil fuels, or as you allude to, the additional impact it has when it comes to climate change. So it is a major killer. And that is the true cost of our reliance on fossil fuels. Anybody who tells you, oh, it's too expensive to move to renewable energy. Actually, renewable energy now is cheaper on a levelized basis. So that's not even true in any sense, but that's not taking into account the massive cost, including the mortality
Human life. We're talking about human
or
life
wars that are
and
fought over
suffering.
fossil fuels.
Yeah, and we're talking about real human suffering,
Yeah,
being abetted really by the wealthiest, probably some of the wealthiest
that's
humans
exactly
ever.
right. That's right, and it's villainous. I mean, and
It
these
is.
fossil fuel barons are villains, and these plutocrats like the Koch brothers who fund this denial apparatus, you know, th- this infrastructure that promotes disinformation about renewable energy and disinformation about climate change, whether it's conservative news networks like Fox News or the New York Post, the Murdoch media empire, the various front groups that plutocrats like the Koch brothers or the Mercers, or any number of these sort of conservative libertarian plutocrats. There is this huge ecosystem of anti-science. And that's what Peter and I talk about in Science Under Siege. It's a coalition between these plutocrats, and petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Russia, and polluters. There's an alliteration here, and propagandists all working together to basically maintain the status quo, keep us addicted to fossil fuels, because they continue to profit, as you allude to. These billionaires profit at the expense of literally everybody else.
Yes, yes, and it's to the point where, again, let's just say you're walking the street, there's car pollution, you're more likely to to get some sort of a challenge with your respiratory system, right? And these little things are cumulative over
That's exactly
your lifespan,
that's
right?
exactly right, and that's one of the reasons that that a lot of those estimates of mortality from the effects of climate change are almost certainly lowball estimates, because they're not taking into account. I mean, very few people, when they die, are they, is the cause of death officially recorded as climate change. It might be extreme heat. It might be, respiratory failure. It might be heart attacks. It might be stroke. Climate change, extreme heat actually increases the incidence of all of those things. And
Yeah.
so the true health footprint is probably even greater than those numbers you typically hear.
Why do you think so? So let's just, in Science Under Siege, you and Dr. Peter Hotez, you examine the forces who are attacking
Yeah.
public trust in science. What do you mean? And you kind of alluded to this, but what do you mean when you say science is under siege? And if we can also bring up the fact that over 10,000 scientists have left the federal government just in 2025. So if you can speak to that, sir.
Yeah, so it's true writ large. We are seeing an assault on science, not just climate change, not just public health science and the science of vaccines, that's the expertise of me and Peter Hotez. And we were focused quite a bit on those particular areas of science, because they do represent two of the existential threats that we face, the climate crisis and the threat of ever more deadly pandemics like the one we just lived through. But the attack on science is much broader, because it's not just about areas of science that are inconvenient to, for political reasons or for financial reasons, monetary reasons, to the power brokers within the Republican Party. And climate change, clearly, because that's fossil fuel industry, sort of anti-vax, vaccine hesitancy, that's also tied to sort of the MAGA movement. And it turns out that both of those were fostered by some of these plutocrats like the Koch brothers, originally because the pandemic was the measures that were being advocated by public health scientists like Tony Fauci or Peter, social distancing, mask wearing, all of these things led to a decrease in transportation, a decrease in energy usage. It was hurting the Koch brothers' bottom line.
Yeah.
So actually, it was, they funded some of these anti-science institutes like the Great Barrington Declaration, the Brownstone Institute, to the same thing they had done with climate for decades, funding these think tanks that promote disinformation.
Which a lot of they learned from the tobacco industry.
Oh, absolutely. And all it's, doubt is our product, was actually a line in the tobacco documents by one of their lawyers, because that was the playbook, and it's been deployed again and again. And what's different now is it isn't just those areas of science, like I just talked about, that might be particularly be a particular threat to, conservative interests. It's science and intellectual pursuits themselves. It's academia, it's our universities, it's the scientific community. It's anybody who is in a position to speak objective truth and to speak truth to power. That is a threat to the MAGA movement.
Yeah. And why do you think that is? Why do you think, let me sort of go back a bit. I mean, during the pandemic, I thought it was particularly disgusting when you had reporting at the time suggesting or indicating that something like there was a mandatory vaccination at Fox, 90%.
That's right.
And yet they're going on the air telling people. I recall Tucker Carlson, who's no longer with Fox. I recall him talking about, don't get that shot. Whatever you do, don't get that shot. A lot of people listened to them and died. And
including Herman Cain.
He went to that rally. This was before the vaccines. He sort of just rolled up. This is during a pandemic, if I recall. And this was at the beginning, before there were any real mitigations.
That's right.
And so all these people listened to them.
Yeah, and especially people like him who are older, perhaps health compromised. Their immune systems aren't as strong. So Herman Cain was actually a perfect example of how tragic, that he bought into that rhetoric. And you may remember he was still tweeting anti-vax propaganda after he was gone.
Yeah, and really shameless. The Trump administration.
It was awful.
They used his account after he was dead.
It was awful. It was awful.
And really,
and it tells you how deeply unethical and immoral these people really are, right?
I don't understand how you can sleep at night. I'll be honest, Professor. If I knew that I was saying things that were clearly against the known scientific consensus at the moment, not saying we knew everything, but there's a lot we did know, right? Particularly wear a mask, social distance. I don't know how these people sleep at night knowing, particularly lots of studies after the fact saying their own market, because they were more concerned about, I think the term they used was audience retention. Absolutely. Right? And so they put the dollar over the sake of their own audience, and they're purporting to be a news network, right?
Yeah. Although I think they're actually legally classified as an entertainment. I think Fox News is actually entertainment, which sort of tells you.
They call themselves Fox News, right?
Exactly. Fox, FAUX News, maybe. Faux news. So it's, you're absolutely right. And again, it's, and Peter and I came together to write this book, really because, early on I saw in what was happening to him and Tony Fauci and other public health scientists, it was sort of a microcosm of what we in the climate world had been through. We've been dealing with this for decades, and we were seeing the same tactics, the same sorts of attacks, the same players going after public health scientists, but on a greatly accelerated time frame. Like, we were watching the whole climate denial campaign that took decades. We saw the same thing playing out over months when the pandemic hit. And so there were so many connections. And I'll give you one to what you just spoke of. Back in the early 1980s, ExxonMobil had an internal report, never saw the light of day until it was leaked, where their own scientists made projections of how much the planet would warm if we continued with business as usual burning of fossil fuels. And in their report, they used the term potentially catastrophic to describe the consequences that we would see by about now. And guess what? We're seeing those catastrophic consequences. So they knew that not only that their policies, that their business model was going to do so much damage and cause so much widespread death. They knew that decades ago, and instead of coming forward with that, again, a lot like the tobacco industry, it's the same story once again. Instead of coming forward and saying what they had found, they doubled down in this campaign of denial and spent tens of billions of dollars to discredit climate scientists like myself, or those who came before me, James Hansen and others, to discredit them while they knew their own scientists had secretly affirmed the very things.
It's evil, right?
There's no other, some people say it's a crime against humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need a new term. I've been arguing this for some time. This is even bigger than that. It's a crime against the planet. It's a crime against all life. And that's the way it should be viewed, more than anything else. We can talk about this in terms of the science and the politics and the economics. And in the end, to me, more than anything else, it's an issue of ethics and our ethical obligation not to mortgage this planet for future generations, and our ethical obligation to take to task and go after those bad actors who are trying to lead us down this path of destruction.
Professor Mann, I follow you on Twitter, and I've seen you sort of push back against people who I think the term is doomer.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, because it's hard, even for people who may follow this, what is a reasonable understanding of where we are now, and what is doom, and again, what does doomer mean in this context, so maybe people can have a realistic understanding of where we're heading.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that question, because this has been especially vexing to those of us who've been in the climate conversation, scientists and science communicators, because it's something that's relatively new. For decades, we were dealing with the disinformation promoted by the fossil fuel industry and their paid advocates and the conservative front groups that put out climate denial propaganda. We had been dealing with that for decades, but we realized we were up against something quite different. I don't know, maybe a decade ago or so, when this really started to emerge, where we were seeing this increasingly prevalent view, a lot of it on social media, spread on social media, that, hey, it's too late to do anything. We've already triggered runaway warming. There's nothing we can do about that. And what it became clear in the New Climate War book I wrote back in 2020, I sort of detail how you can follow sort of where this emerged and how it was being used. And there were there was a lot of inauthentic online, social media activity that appeared to be tied to, bad state actors, Russia, Saudi Arabia,
who have a financial motive in undermining.
Absolutely. They are petrostates that want to see us remain. And by the way, it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia and Russia both leveraged Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter.
Right.
And we know what happened to Twitter after that. It became weaponized to promote anti-science propaganda, climate denial propaganda. Ironic, since Elon Musk was once, in a sense, sort of this hero of the climate movement, and he's undergone this Bond villain-like arc that's, just remarkable, from hero to villain. But it became clear that a lot of these bad actors realized that, like progressives, environmental progressives, people on the left who are honestly concerned about climate change and want to do something about it, they realize that, hey, if we can convince them that it's too late to do anything, then they're not on
what we're doing.
They're not on the front lines anymore. They're on the sidelines, and that's where we want them. So the truth is, I'll just finish the thought.
Sure.
So the truth is that, the truth is bad enough, as my good friend, a mentor of mine, passed away some years ago, Steve Schneider, used to say, the truth is bad enough. We don't have to exaggerate it, especially to the point where it leads to this sense of doom and despair. There is urgency in taking action, no question about it, but there is agency. We still have agency in doing something about the problem. So it's urgency paired with agency. And my messaging always sort of uses that framing. Yes, it's bad, and it's going to get a whole lot worse if we don't take action, but we can take action. The obstacles aren't physical. They're not the physical climate system. They're not technological. We've got the technology for a clean energy economy. They are political, and political obstacles, as you guys know, they can be overcome.
And so, Professor Mann, I mean, kind of what you're alluding to is vote. If you
these are my sort of top three actions that you can take to do something. Number one, vote. Number two, vote. Number three, vote.
Okay.
Don't talk about Fight Club. No, it's vote. Because look, we should all do everything we can within the context of our individual lifestyles to minimize our environmental impact and minimize our carbon footprint. Why wouldn't we do that? In many cases, it saves us money, makes us healthier. It sets a good example for other people. Do all those things, but don't let the fossil fuel companies and their propagandists convince you that that is the only thing that we need to do, because individual action isn't going to solve this problem. We need systemic change. We need incentives to move us away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And the only way we're going to get those incentives is we elect policymakers, politicians who care about us rather than politicians who are just a rubber stamp for the polluters who fund their campaigns and funnel money to them.
Professor, a couple more questions. I've heard some people, and I think you've pushed back on this online a little, but I just want to get your thoughts. That climate change, it's obviously reducing emissions, but it's also an engineering problem that like we can, again, these are solutions that are still very, very new, right? And they're not solutions, right? It's not proven, right? But there's a lot of talk. Okay, we can spray, I think it was sulfates or something in the and we could do that, and that will have some mitigating effect. We can take some of the carbon, we can rebury it, right? Again, I'm not an expert on this, right? But I mean, is there any hope or validity, I would say, in those engineering solutions? Beyond, so there's emissions, obviously we have to lower, but in terms of the greater, let's say over the next 100 years.
So, we've hit on a number of the D words in my book, The New Climate War, as denial becomes untenable, because we can all see it's happening. The bad actors, the polluters, have turned to these other tactics, and we've talked about some of them. Deflection. We just need individual action. It's just about your individual carbon footprint, because they don't want systemic change. They don't want policy. We talked about doomism. It's another D word, despair and doomism, promoting, so doom mongering. Division. getting us fighting with each other online, on social media, through inauthentic accounts that create conflict and get climate advocates arguing with each other, so they're not taking the fight to the enemy. And now you've brought up the D of delay tactics. So this idea that, hey, look, we've got a solution. We will spray aerosol particles, sulfate particles into the stratosphere. We'll put iron in the ocean to fertilize the algae. And what could possibly go wrong? And trust us, we'll do this. We'll do this in the future. So we can continue to
do what we're doing
burn
now.
Fossil fuels now because we've got this solution that we will deploy. Trust us. So it's a get out of jail free card for the fossil fuel industry. It's a way to kick the can down the road. And so, of course, they have promoted a lot this idea that there's just some simple technofix, be it massive carbon capture and sequestration, which is just no way to scale that up in an economic manner that's on the time frame it would need to, but it gives them a talking point. The sulfate aerosols, spraying them into the stratosphere to cool down the planet. Again, it gives them a talking point. It allows fossil fuel interests to say, hey, we've got solutions. We want to do something. And here, that's why, Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, famously said, that was when ExxonMobil made the pivot. Lee Raymond, the previous CEO, was a hardcore climate denier. Rex Tillerson was not. He was not a climate denier. He said, yeah, climate change is real and it's just an engineering problem. We just need to use technology and our we just ingenuity. And they love these sort of empty words that have the appearance of action but are hollow. And geoengineering, I'll just say this, my good friend Adam McKay, who I've talked to many times about movie director, actually like movies like Step Brothers, which is just hilarious, sort of raucous movies. But he also did, he's done more serious movies that have a clear message, like Vice, which was about actually Vice President Cheney, but the final scene shows a montage of climate-related disasters. And he was actually pointing out that it was at that point where the Republican Party, when Dick Cheney took control of sort of the energy policy, W was actually on the right side of the issue. George W. Bush was on the right side of the issue. It was Dick Cheney and his energy industry pals who took over the policy. And Adam speaks to that in Vice. At the very end, the final scene, you see flames and floods, and that's what he's saying. That's where things went awry as far as the Republican Party is concerned. Actually, The Campaign, another Adam McKay movie, which is about the corrupting impact of the Koch brothers, these plutocrats, billionaire plutocrats, and Don't Look Up, which was clearly, a very thinly disguised allegory about the climate crisis. The comet is the climate, and it's about the all the bad actors who conspire to sort of to block any meaningful progress. The corrupt politicians, a corrupted media, media outlets that are and the point I was going to make is the villain. The most memorable villain in the movie, this Peter Isherwell. He's this technocrat guy, billionaire, sort of reclusive, obviously on the spectrum.
You're talking about Don't Look Up, right?
Don't Look Up. Oh, sorry. I said before the. Did I say before the flood? I said, yeah. Don't Look Up. Don't Look Up. The movie Don't Look Up is what we're talking about here. I apologize. And this Peter Isherwell is this billionaire tycoon plutocrat, clearly on the spectrum, as I said. He's sort of an amalgamation of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, and he's got a solution. And if you understand the analogies of the movie and how it relates to the climate crisis, his solution is geoengineering. Yeah, he's going to profit greatly from this, this proprietary technology he has to mine, to break up the comet into fragments and mine them for valuable minerals and metals and that are the profits of which all go to him.
Right,
And,
right.
and of course, I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen the film, but Adam was very clearly speaking to the false promise of geoengineering as a solution to the problem. And so, I think Adam got it exactly right. I think he was very clever in finding a very effective analogy for how pernicious this idea that, hey, we've got some techno fix. We don't have to reduce carbon emissions. We can just rely on our own technology, which we're funding and we're profiting from. Trust us.
Let me ask you, Professor, I hear what you say, and I think what you said about doomerism is I think very appropriate, because once people lose hope, they go to the sidelines and they're not pushing for change. But going back to where we are right now, Professor, are there any tipping points, climate tipping points, that you're actually worried about, let's say today, that you're monitoring?
Yeah. I mean, there are tipping points that we hear about that I'm less concerned about. I don't think the science supports, for example, this idea that the Arctic permafrost is going to burp huge amounts of methane. We don't see that, and the models don't predict that. But the models have underestimated some of the potential tipping points. The collapse of the ice sheets, we're seeing that earlier than we expected. We're seeing them contribute to sea level rise earlier than we expected. The collapse of the so-called ocean conveyor belt circulation, popularized in another movie, The Day After Tomorrow, which was a caricature of what the science actually says. But that's a tipping point that would have huge implications. If that ocean circulation pattern were to collapse, wouldn't lead to another ice age. It wouldn't lead to most of the things depicted in that film, but it would actually cause more sea level rise along the east coast of the US for reasons I won't go into that are pretty complicated. It would actually lead to a tremendous decrease in marine productivity in the North Atlantic Ocean, which is the greatest source of, greatest natural fishery in the world. And 25% of our population rely on seafood for their primary source of protein. So it would have dire consequences. And those tipping points, here's the thing, we don't know where they lie, right? We don't know how close we are to them. So that's an important asterisk here, that, the more we warm the planet, the more likely it is that we cross some of these tipping points. I liken them to mines in a minefield. We don't know exactly where they are. What we do know is you don't want to be walking out onto that minefield, because you're gonna trip those mines. And that's what we're doing. We're walking out onto a minefield. And so the only sensible thing is to stop that forward lurch onto the minefield. And that means decarbonizing as quickly as we can. Fortunately, there's some good news, as we said earlier, that, that the planet responds almost immediately to those efforts. And so it's just about the obstacles at this point are political.
Let me, if you were speaking to a young scientist entering climate science today, what would you tell them, Professor?
Plastics. No, sorry, I'm just kidding. It's an old joke that nobody will get if they're not
from The Graduate, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Which ironically, plastics are part of the problem today. One of the other great global environmental threats, the global plastic pollution, which thanks to the same petrochemical industry that gave us the climate crisis. So maybe there's something there.
Future in plastics was what was in the Graduate. Not to give away to the story, but this guy, I think, graduates college, and at the time, I think this was 1967, maybe.
Yes, that sounds right. Yeah.
And
it turned out it was actually pretty good advice.
It was, yeah. But it wasn't good for the environment.
It wasn't good for the environment. It was good for the economic bottom line of people who are in that industry, and that's the same problem we have with the fossil fuel industry today. What I would say, science. I don't want to be too parochial here, because obviously I'm a climate scientist. I actually started out as a physicist. I was theoretical physics. That was sort of the road I was headed down. And then I realized there was a real opportunity to work on a really interesting and important problem midway through graduate school. And then I went into sort of geosciences and climate science. But to me, yeah, it's great that the science that we do has real world consequences, and that's part of what attracted me to it ultimately. But science, is the pursuit of knowledge at a very basic level, and so to those who enjoy that process of discovery, um, just follow your heart. There's so much important work to be done in basic science, and you don't know what the applications will be down the road. So when we pursue you know sort of blue skies, science questions. Down the road, they may have practical applications that we can't even anticipate at the time. And so I would say, if you're a young scientist, follow your heart. The most important thing is to be passionate about what you're doing. You're not going to be a good scientist if you don't love doing science, because you've got to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, put so much mental energy into it. You've got to love it, and you've got to love what you're working on. And to me, I was fortunate in that I was able to find something that I was passionate about, climate science, that also turned out to have real world implications. I couldn't imagine that, when I first decided to major in physics and applied math at UC Berkeley and started out in theoretical physics at Yale University, that I would ultimately be at the center of the most contentious scientific debate in humans, in the history of human civilization. And I've had, trials and tribulations because of our work and the attention it attracted from polluters and the attacks on me and the hockey stick. But in the end, I feel privileged to have, found myself in a position where I have a voice in this conversation about what is arguably the greatest challenge and opportunity that we face as a civilization. But I wouldn't have, I only ended up there because I sort of followed my heart, what felt right to me, what felt interesting to me, and what felt important to me.
This has been such a great conversation, Professor Mann, and we'd really love to have you back on to discuss this and other
would love to. Yeah,
scientific matters. I would like to, this last question, it sort of goes to what we discussed before, but 100 years from now, let's say it's July 9th, July 10th, July 11th, 26, 100 years. How will they look back at this present moment, you think, as it relates to climate change and fossil fuels and emissions? And they're seeing us today, adults, right, just going about their lives. How do you think we will look?
Well, I'm, in our book, I was the one who insisted on a Tolkien-esque framing of this moment, because I do think that this is a Tolkien-esque battle that we're in. And as the forces of good win out in that tale, and I feel compelled to believe that we will ultimately prevail in this battle. But I have no illusions about the fact that we are the underdog in this battle. The forces that are marshaled against us, that are mobilized against us, are immensely powerful, immensely well organized, and obviously are tied to the largest economic force in the world today, the fossil fuel industry. And so we are the underdogs in this battle, but we have truth and science and ethics. Everything that is good is on our side. Everything that is bad is on our side. And it forces me to believe that we will ultimately prevail. And that's an act of faith, I have to say, on my part. As much as I'm a scientist, it is an act of faith on my part, faith in humankind, a sort of stubborn and resilient faith in humankind, which has been greatly challenged over the past several years, that we will prevail, but it won't be after a very hard fought and damaging and ugly battle to do away with this to do in this fossil fuel juggernaut that threatens us today. And it will take all of us. It will take every single person who cares about this planet, who cares about the future of humanity. If we all work together, we can defeat these forces of darkness.
Well, Professor Mann, it was an honor to have you here today. Discuss your books, discuss your scientific background, discuss sort of your understanding of climate change, and really help inform the audience about all these really important matters. So I want to say it was a great honor to have you here, sir, and we look forward to having you back on again.
Yeah, no, the honor was mine, Brian, and I'd love to come back. So thank you so much.